in the full screen mode? Am I in full
Yep.
screen mode, or am I in presenter mode?
Full screen.
Full screen, perfect. Okay, so it's a bit of a catch here. Sometimes it comes up full screen, sometimes it will come up in display mode. So I always try and ask that question. So let's build upon the panel session that I had earlier with my great panelists there, and talk about what is going to happen or what is happening to healthcare from an AI perspective, and how is that radically going to really change the industry. I mean, we are on the cusp of some very interesting times in healthcare. And we're also seeing some very interesting attack vectors and some very interesting threats against healthcare. I mean, I've been in the cybersecurity space for near on 30 years now. And 30 years ago, the threats were hacktivists and script kiddies. And that, is paled in by comparison, to some of the massive organized crime extortion attacks of ransomware against healthcare. And of course, the nation state attacks that have afflicted us most recently. COVID research, going back to January, February last year, once COVID became a thing globally, we saw massive levels of attacks by nation states against biopharmaceuticals, against healthcare delivery organizations, and against those who were researching potential cures for COVID, right? Either in forms of vaccination or in terms of treatment options, right? So massive amounts of patient data were stolen from our hospital systems, and many labs were absolutely pillaged by some very highly sophisticated attacks, to the extent that Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State at the time, threatened a very, very nasty response to those who executed those particular attacks. Of course, they continued, but not to the degree that they were before. More recently, we've had the Hafnium attack against Microsoft Exchange, a highly sophisticated nation-state attack. We've also had the SolarWinds attack, right? A supply chain attack against our institutions, and this has impacted healthcare. A lot of healthcare organizations have their own Exchange servers on site, and a lot of them use SolarWinds in order to manage their accounts. If we look at, or their email accounts, if we look at the attack vectors, on the left-hand side in blue, for those who may not be colorblind, we have the perpetrators of attack, and on the right-hand side in green, we have the victims of attack. And this is a chart I found at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, just explaining the geographical distribution of attacks and where these are coming from now and against whom. And you can see there that the United States is by far the largest single victim of cyber attacks executed by the four principal nefarious players out there: China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Of course, there are other players as well, but by volume, these are the most significant. So our approach to security needs to be one that is cognitive of where the threats are coming from. There's a big question as who's on your network, or who owns your network today, right? And it's not just a question of theft of intellectual property, or for cyber espionage. This is a question of trying to undermine the very trust in our political institutions. The hacking of the US election back in 2016 and threats thereof of doing the same in 2020, but also the theft of intellectual property for certain nation states, state-owned enterprises, where the state gains the benefit from the theft of that intellectual property. And we've seen over the last 15 years a massive amount of data stolen from Western, European and American principally, as well as Israeli pharmaceutical companies for use in China's pharmaceutical state-owned enterprises, so to speak. And their 5-year plan indicates that China should be the leader in pharmaceuticals by 2025. So not long to go, and they've certainly got enough data to make that hurdle using everyone else's research. But things are about to change, and this is where I get to the point about AI. AI is really changing healthcare. It's about to change it significantly. I mentioned in my panel earlier about how AI is used for clinical decision support, right? How doctors make decisions based not purely upon their gut feeling and their education. And of course, doctors spend many, many years studying to be who they are. And they're some of the brightest people I've ever had the privilege of working with. Not that there aren't bright people in cybersecurity, but we're now using massive data treasure troves, data lakes of previous patient outcomes, and saying statistically, tell me the best possible course of action for this patient in this age group with these exhibiting these conditions with this particular medical problem. Tell me statistically where my best course of treatment will lead to, the least chance of patient morbidity and mortality of that particular patient, and potentially a full return, full recovery, speed recovery for that patient to re-enter the workforce, to re-enter society, as a productive person. And AI is doing that for us, right? Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, a lot of these other pioneering institutions are using AI very effectively around this particular decision support mechanisms. We're also seeing this in radiological medicine, right? We can use AI to enhance X-rays and CT scans to provide indication of the formation of a cancer cell before that cancer cell actually develops into a tumor, right? We're seeing the cells rearrange themselves in such a way that this is indicative, based upon big data, of what's happened in the past. So we can bring that patient in for treatment before they end up with a tumor, and before it's obviously, too late, that tumor becomes malignant, and then we end up in a very, very high cost solution in order to try and keep that patient alive for as long as possible with radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and a whole load of other treatment options that we're using today, which are disruptive to the patient, disruptive to their lives, and cost a large amount of money. But we're also seeing AI used for cyber attacks, things like deep fakes. I'm sure most of the people on this presentation, on this conference today, are fully aware of deep fakes, right? We're all seeing this on the internet, but we may not be cognitively ready for the types of deep fake attacks that we're likely to see in the future. We're all used to, seeing the tabloids of a particularly famous person in an image and wondering to ourselves, is that a photoshopped image, right? We're not cognitively prepared for video and audio deepfakes that are computer enhanced and look a lot better than even some of the best photoshoppers out there that can insert us in a particular picture. The big question is it Alex or is it Donald, right? And we've got this type of technology now that allows us to emulate someone and to say something totally different to what they've actually said. And this is being used in CEO fraud, or business email compromises is also known as, which is netting billions of dollars in scams every year, because we now have technology that can emulate the voice of the CEO, the CFO, and a phone call will come in or a voicemail will come in to say, I'm going on vacation, I forgot to pay this particular bill. Here's the account number in the Cayman Islands. Please wire $200,000 or $300,000 to this particular account, and I'll sort out the paperwork when I get back. It's got to be there by tomorrow morning, right? Sense of urgency. It's normally an indicator that something hinky's up, but people don't really check because we don't have the processes in place to validate the request, right? We don't have that multi-factor. We don't have that process in place for multi sign-off over these types of things. And if most of us receive a call from the CEO, we tend to drop what we're doing and act on it straight away. But it leads to other questions, right? Did the election candidate say what we heard them say on TV or in a video, right? And offensive AI can be used not just to degrade our confidence in politicians or their reputation or the institutions of government, but it can also be used to attack institutions, commercial institutions. They're highly sophisticated attacks. They're able to recognize security tools on our networks and bypass them because they know what characteristics those security tools use in order to recognize an attack. They can go very quietly, very softly, very subliminally. They can be unnoticed for many months in in an APT style attack, but using AI rather than, individuals that maybe have a foothold on our network. And we've seen examples of that in the Emotet banking Trojan, and how that has evolved to self-propagate and to generalize contextualized emails using AI's ability to learn and replicate natural language by analyzing the context of the email thread. So we can have AI that inserts itself into an email chain, an existing email chain, and insert instructions into that email chain that can then be used for business email compromise, or can be used for some other nefarious process. And we're seeing the weaponization of these non-AI malware strains by perpetrators in the space, right? And there are massive consequences. In healthcare, there are life-threatening consequences, right? If we undermine the integrity of data and trust in our medical systems, our medical records, then doctors have a lower level of confidence that the information they're seeing, the X-ray they're seeing, the CT scan that they're seeing, the medical record that they're reading is in fact actually legitimate. Is it correct? Right? Our doctors and nurses are trained to follow the data, right? They're scientists. They follow the X-ray image or the CT scan, and they act upon that information. But the minute that information is challenged, so the confidence in that information declines, right? It would be very easy for an AI bot to get into my medical record and change my blood type, my allergies, my medical history, and the procedures that I may be in hospital for the day before my surgery. No one would be any wiser. And instead of getting an operation for a gastric bypass, right, because I've been sat at home stuffing chips in my face and drinking wine or whatever for the last year through COVID, I go in and I have my left arm amputated, or worse, my mouse arm, right? These types of things could be extremely detrimental. Imagine if someone's blood type were changed and they were filled up post-operative with the wrong blood, or they were given antibiotics as a result of a minor blood infection or transfusion infection, and they're highly allergic to antibiotics, but that doesn't present itself on the record because that data has been changed, right? What happens when a physician makes a diagnosis based upon that compromised data? Who's liable, right? These integrity type attacks, which we're beginning to see with AI, are a massive, massive concern, right? We've also got a problem with speed, right? AI can understand our defensive postures, right? The pieces that we put into play in order to defend against attack, and can go straight the way around them. Traditional security controls are totally impotent against this type of threat. And this is going to be concerning, even to some of the more advanced technologies that we have out there that we're using to defend against attacks. And this is really where defensive AI comes in, right? We need to fight fire with fire here, right? We need to use defensive AI in order to combat offensive AI, right? We need tools that have defensive AI built into them to recognize an offensive AI and to counter attack that offensive AI, or to neutralize that offensive AI quickly, right? We're going to require a heavy investment in new security tools and capabilities. And according to Forrester, and I noticed that we had Jay, I think it was, from Forrester on earlier this morning, but Forrester has predicted this as I think it was a couple of years ago. I read a report talking about mainstream AI-powered hacking is just a matter of time, right? So this is coming. We need to be prepared for it, and we need to build in AI into our defensive tools. We need nanosecond responses to attacks moving forward, rather than putting a human in the middle to make a decision. Now, obviously, there is going to be a role for humans. We definitely can't have AI running amok, otherwise we'd end up in some kind of Skynet type scenario where the machines take over, and that's plainly not going to happen anytime in my lifetime. Although who's to say what happens 100 years from now? But we need AI-based tools that have the speed and the flexibility and the cognitive recognition in order to respond to the types of sophisticated attacks that we're going to see, right? But it has to be a partnership between humans and AI, and we program that AI based upon different attack scenarios, just as we would, any other defensive posture, whether you're a military commander, and building plans for attacks coming in from different vectors, or whether you're a security operations leader and building plans for a cyber attack. This is very much the future, right? A number of new tools are already using machine learning and AI, and in fact, my company uses machine learning to recognize devices on the networks and to perform risk analysis of those IoT devices, or subliminally, so that it doesn't take a human intervention, and we don't need to hire 100 people to run around a network to find those types of devices. Biomedical security tools that use AI to constantly manage and secure the rising number of healthcare IoT devices, right, is a prime example of how machine learning is being built into this. We can also examine some of the advanced malware tools that are out there, right, to next generation firewall technology, to human behavioral analysis tools and system anomaly detection tools, right? These are all going to be AI enhanced if they aren't already, and we're going to see increasing levels of, in my opinion, of the use of AI in these types of defensive tools to defend against an increasingly well-armed adversary. So what does this really matter for healthcare? Well, as I mentioned in our healthcare panel an hour ago or half an hour ago, that digital transformation has really changed the healthcare industry. Meaningful use for the exchange of information across different providers, insurers, population health, remote medication and medicine via telehealth and telemedicine, and everything else that's come about over the last year as we scramble to get our public health system into a situation that could support people locked in their houses at home, right, under no travel orders, right, combining with the growth of massive levels of medical devices, which are growing at 20% per annum, right? There are now 3 times as many, or more than 3 times as many devices on our networks that are IoT or unmanaged devices compared to the traditional, Windows managed devices that were prevalent as little as 10 years ago. And this is changing the threat vector, changing the threat surface of healthcare, and placing us at additional risks. As I mentioned earlier, medical devices have grown at an astronomical rate, and they continue to grow at an astronomical rate because they're replacing the need for additional nurses. I don't know if any of you, work in the healthcare space, but you'll know how difficult it is to try and find nurses for a lot of the mundane jobs in hospitals, for taking blood pressure, for example, or O2 saturation, and reporting that, charting those patients, and putting that into an EMR so that our doctors can make the appropriate treatment decisions based upon us. We are replacing machinery with humans in order to automate processes, and that extends right the way throughout the hospital. If you've been in some of the new teaching hospitals, you'll see robots that travel across the floor. They contain drugs or files, and they move from floor to floor, and they control the elevators to get from floor to floor, and they go around and they fill up Pixis cabinets that are computerized cabinets that dispense medication for patients, and they do a whole heap of other things in cath labs and various aspects of hospital, and they are increasing in number. It's a massive growth area, but they're all connected today, right? And that presents a broader threat surface for us that we need to defend. So to summarize this, you can't really risk assess what you don't know about. So we need AI-based tools to identify and assess those growing number of AI-connected assets. We need better investigation to understand what AI-type devices are being used on our network to enhance radiological systems and what information they're sharing. We need to, better visibility into those large data pools of clinical data that we're using for decision support. And we need to assess all of these risks on a more holistic nature than what we've done in the past. The idea of a controls-based risk analysis should be ancient history by now, but there are still healthcare providers and many other non-healthcare organizations that are still using controls-based assessments rather than asset-based assessments to, let's just say, a NIST 800-30 standard, for example, which is the standard that we use in the United States. So why is it such a concern? Well, patient safety, right? You can't insure against patient loss. And several of the other presenters today talked about the rising costs of cyber risk insurance, for trying to protect your organization against, highly sophisticated perpetrators of cybercrime, whether they're organized, the Russian mob, for example, out extorting money via ransomware, or nation state actors that are looking to either destroy data or to steal data or to corrupt data, right? Patient safety cannot be insured against. You cannot put a price on grandma's life, right? If grandma is at risk of cyber attack or some kind of availability attack in a hospital. And we saw this last September, I think it was, in University of Dusseldorf Hospital, where a German woman was brought into the emergency room of a hospital and couldn't be treated because the university's medical systems had been encrypted by a Russian perpetrator out to extort money from the university, and didn't realize that his attack vector, I'm assuming it's him, hadn't impacted the medical systems of the university health system. That woman was placed into an ambulance and transported across town, whereupon she died en route or shortly after arriving because she couldn't receive treatment within the requisite 30 minutes of her particular medical condition. I don't know what that medical condition is, but we've generally got about 30 to 40 minutes to treat a patient from the time that they have a heart attack or a stroke or some other debilitating situation that places them in need of emergency care. So availability and integrity are a growing concern around patient safety. It's got to the point now where we don't really care too much, or many of us don't really care too much about the loss of confidentiality, right? If my medical records get stolen for a fifth or a sixth time, who cares, right? As long as it's not going to impact my ability to survive, not going to negatively impact patient morbidity and patient mortality, it's a slap on the wrist, a regulatory fine, but it's not going to cause the FBI to come to my hospital and interview all of my executives because 17 of my patients were executed in their bed by cyber attackers that either compromised the devices and blue screened them all, or changed the data and therefore caused a medical complication as a result of that particular change. These are things that we don't typically want to think about, and we don't want to talk about either, but this is the growing threat vector impacting in healthcare. And as we all know, when healthcare is attacked, things don't generally end too well. And this is a growing concern, obviously. So what are the future? Well, to summarize, we've got a rise in automated attacks that we're already beginning to see. And Forrester has substantiated this through some of its writings, and Gartner has done the same about the rising AI attack vector. So automated attacks that are using AI are going to require automated attacks in order to defend against AI, right? We need better tools. We need better processes. We need a partnership between technology and people in order to automatically remediate and to protect against some of the risks, right? And we need to be able to do this in the background, because I think we've all realized now that the magnitude of attacks is such that security leaders and their teams aren't going to have the time to deal with all of these little things, right? We've now got hundreds of thousands of network connected devices on our hospital networks. That is being compounded by wearables, right? By our Apple Watches that now feed into our medical records. And many countries, particularly Australia, which has formalized this, now allows you to put your activity, your blood pressure, your EKG results from your personal wearable device into your medical record, because it helps your care team to provide you the right advice and guidance and dietary input, shall we say, or dietary advice for you in order to stay healthy longer and to obviously save the health system, whether it's public or private, vast amounts of money. We spend 86% of our public health spend in the United States is spent on the treatment of compound chronic disease. So high blood pressure, obesity, heart problems, etc. Right? And these are all brought around because of our healthy living style in the United States. We don't exercise enough. We eat the wrong foods. Our our health system doesn't recognize early enough the development of medical conditions that, if they were treated earlier, would be relatively minor, right? Relatively low cost. And we leave all of that till we're retired, till we're over 65, when we're subject to Medicare, right? Because we don't fund Medicaid sufficiently in order to cater for those people that don't have access to healthcare, and that builds into our Medicare budgets, right? When those really sick people get into the end of their their typical lifespan and become subject to compound disease treatment that costs us a large amount of money. We need to rethink what we're doing around public health in the United States, and right the way across the world. I think a lot of health systems are thinking that in the light of COVID. But we also need to think very carefully about the types of tools and technologies and approaches that we make to defending against healthcare. And with that, I'd like to open up to questions. I have made this deck available. There's a URL down there. I truncated it as short as I can. I guarantee, I promise it won't take you to any malicious website that's going to pull down nefarious code to your laptop or your workstation. But feel free to reach me here. And I think we've got a few questions. Is that right?
Well, no, it was more comments on things related to the event. But one thing I think that we could ask is, you very kindly supported and spoken at a lot of MSS type of conferences, as well as the healthcare MSS event. With an event dedicated to just this one topic, what do you hope that will end up coming out of it having achieved?
I think we need to take a step back, right? I mean, I've been a security leader for a large part, most of my professional life here, and we tend to get into the routine of doing the same things, applying the same formula, right? Plus or minus, minor regulatory changes. I think we need to take a step back here, and we need to say, okay, instead of me just buying this new shiny object that I need for my repertoire, my defensive tools against cyber attack, let's take a step back and let's rethink the entire security risk paradigm approach here, right? We need to do a better job of recognizing risk. We need to do a better job of addressing risks in a more timely manner. And that includes basic things like patching and general housekeeping, but it also includes the types of tools that the industry as a whole is making available to us, and the types of approaches that government and regulators are espousing via healthcare policy.
Well, we can but hope. But we are now out of time. We are out of time. But this is great, and I'm glad we got to have this presentation after the panel, because the panel set the context. I'm looking forward to welcoming you on Thursday for the DMV event.
Likewise, Philip. Always a pleasure, my friend.
And yes, please give Richard a great virtual round of applause. I'll see you in the audience.
Thank you now.
See you soon. Perfect. And of course,